Later Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Glad you're here. We got a great show today. We're going to talk about the New Way Forward Act. So the easiest way to put that is it's the Green New Deal, but for immigration. And it's insane. So we'll talk about that coming up in a little bit. And also, we're going to talk, yesterday we talked about the Clarence Thomas documentary that's out now in a theater near you. We're going to talk with the filmmaker coming up at the end of the show as well. But first, got to start here. I'm always interested in how people come to their beliefs in anything, really, political, religious. It doesn't matter why people think the way they do and why people act the way they do. I'm just super interested in where that comes from, because it comes from somewhere, and usually from someone's childhood. So just a couple examples, like Kevin Spacey, right? He did all these horrible things, and I remember reading about his childhood. His dad was a horrible person. It's one of the worst stories I've ever heard. He would rape his sons repeatedly. He taped pornography all around the walls of their house. Kevin, when he was a kid, he could never invite anyone over because his dad was just a monster. Elton John, wife and I, we just watched that movie Rocket Man. His dad hated him, left the family. His mom was cruel. No one ever said, "I love you." No one ever hugged him. He was never comfortable with himself, and this explains, among other things, just the over-the-top costumes that he always wore. He was always trying to run from being Reggie. And he made up this whole fake persona to try and find love. Bill Clinton, his mom, no one ever talks about this. Bill Clinton's mom abused him horrifically as a child. Hillary did an interview back in 1999 and said, Bill's mom hurt him in ways you wouldn't believe. And she said, when that happens to you as a child, it scars you. And she said, you keep looking in all the wrong places for the parent who abused you, right? So you look for things to numb the pain. So we can do this all day, right? And I want to say, I'm not making excuses for bad behavior, just trying to find the root of it all. And it's true for all of us. We all have traumatic moments in our childhood that has changed the way we think, and therefore the way we act. So Bernie Sanders, that's my big introduction for Bernie Sanders. Why is Bernie Sanders a communist or a democratic socialist, whatever? Why is he a commie? What happened in his childhood that set him down this road to where he is today? Imagine a 6-year-old Bernie. 6-year-old Bernie Sanders living in Brooklyn, New York. There was an ice cream man in town, came by his street every couple days, and Bernie would grab a nickel and go buy a popsicle. But some days, there would be a really large crowd around the ice cream man. And Bernie's 6 years old, he never knew why. And whenever there was a crowd, it was always a crowd of men, right? Sometimes there was a crowd of kids, but then every once in a while, there's this big crowd of men around the ice cream man. And he didn't know why. Turns out the ice cream man was also the local bookie. And he was taking bets on the tonight's Brooklyn Dodgers baseball game. Bernie was a massive Brooklyn Dodgers fan. Today, right now, if you ask him, he's 78. If you ask him the starting lineup of the Yankees and the Dodgers from 1956, he'll rattle it off the top of his head. He remembers one time when he was 6 years old, he stayed home from school, he was sick, and someone dropped off at his house a Brooklyn Dodgers shirt. And today, he still says that was a very meaningful present to me. He's 78, this is when he was 6, and he remembers receiving that gift. He would go with his friends to Ebbets Field. It would take about 30 minutes to get there. And he'd go to as many games as he could. He learned arithmetic by calculating the batting averages. He'd sit in the stands and he'd cheer on Jackie Robinson and more importantly, Sandy Koufax, who was Jewish. Fast forward, he was 16. And really no exaggeration, one of the most traumatic things that could possibly happen for a 16-year-old Brooklyn Dodgers fan happened. They moved to LA. It was traumatic for him. He was shocked, came out of nowhere. Today he says it was like they moved the Brooklyn Bridge to California. How can you move the Brooklyn Bridge to California? Now, you may think I'm making all this up. Right? And I know on my radio show for years, we've been sharing stories about people's childhood. We're going to do it coming up about Clarence Thomas and how that shaped him as an adult. And I know that whenever I talk about this, people in the news and I talk about the childhood and why they act this way, every time I can feel the skepticism. And I know this TV is only one way, right? So I can't see you roll your eyes, but I know you're rolling your eyes. And like, oh, here goes Slater again. All right, so Slater, you're saying Bernie's on the far left because the Brooklyn Dodgers left for LA when he was 16. That's what you're trying to tell me? Yes. Yes, that's right. That's exactly what I'm telling you. But in reality, I can't even take credit for this insight. It's actually not that insightful. He pretty much said as much. He said, I don't want to tell you that it was the sole reason that I've developed the politics that I've developed. But as a kid, I did see in that case about the Dodgers, about the greed of one particular company, and that impacted me. Another time recently, he was telling a story of him growing up, and he said, I remember when I used to walk down my old Brooklyn, my old neighborhood in Brooklyn, and then he kind of trailed off, and he said, that was before the Dodgers went to Los Angeles, which was the worst thing that ever happened. Right? Just just an aside, that's the worst thing that ever happened. He's 78, he hasn't gotten over it. This is the New York Times said, perhaps no single event has proved more enduring in Mr. Sanders' consciousness, more viscerally felt in his signature fury towards the 1%, than the day he was told that his neighborhood heroes belonged to someone else. Bernie's a commie because the Dodgers left LA. One of the worst emotions that a human can feel is betrayal. And you can brush the story off as like a silly thing. It's just a baseball team, whatever. And it is a silly and all that. But not to a 16-year-old boy. This was a massive betrayal. So have I proven, before we move on, have I proven how important this was to him? This moment was and is imprinted on his heart. Now, here's why it's relevant today. He thinks that the Dodgers left because of greed. And because of that, his entire life from that point forward, he looks at everything through the lens of greed. Just like Karl Marx, he believed that the world operates, capitalism operates based off of greed. And he hates it. And in a way, he's right? So like we are greedy, everyone's greedy. So the question really is not greed or no greed. The question is what economic system best transforms that greed into something productive for the most amount of people. Here's what Milton Friedman, it's a famous clip of Milton Friedman when he was asked about greed.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy.
Now, here's the rest of the story that no one told poor Bernie when he was 16. Walter O'Malley, he was the owner of the Dodgers. People at the time, and it's still a joke, Bernie will tell this joke today, that the three worst people in Brooklyn, from the people of Brooklyn, the three worst people were Hitler, Stalin, and O'Malley, not necessarily in that order. Right? So everyone blames O'Malley for leaving, but it really wasn't his fault. Robert Moses, he was the New York City planning czar. He had the power to stop any development he wanted. And it was that guy, it was Robert Moses, who stopped the building of the new stadium in Brooklyn. There's a book by Robert Caro called Power Broker about the life of Robert Moses. This guy, Robert Moses, he was never elected to anything, but at one point, he held 12 official titles at the same time in New York City. This guy was incredibly powerful and had no accountability whatsoever. I get like the title people give him was Master Builder of New York City. That's kind of like the catch-all. He was the Master Builder of New York City. He had a ton of power. Now O'Malley, the Ebbets Field was falling down in the 50s. O'Malley wanted to build the nation's first domed stadium. This was about 7 or so years before Houston built the Astrodome. And he wanted to build it in what today is where the Barclays Center currently is. And Robert Moses wouldn't let him. And O'Malley wanted to pay for it. The catch was, O'Malley said, listen, I'll pay for the new stadium. I want the city to commit to improve some infrastructure around it. And at the time, that meant getting the sign off from Robert Moses. And he didn't want it there. Robert Moses didn't want the stadium there. He said, O'Malley, I'll let you build a stadium in Queens, which is where Shea Stadium and now Citi Field currently is. But O'Malley didn't want to leave Brooklyn, right? So you alienate your Brooklyn fans and then just move down the street to Queens where there's not really a new market. So you're just like, that's not a good win for him. So he's like, I don't want to go to Queens. So he took a better deal from LA. That's why he left. So there's a lot to that story. But the point is, at best, this is not a story of a greedy team owner. It's the fault of an unelected, powerful bureaucrat coming out of a New Deal era where people thought that cities should be run by massive central planners with the ability to make huge decisions for an entire city. It wasn't capitalism. It wasn't greed's fault, which in Bernie Sanders' mind, those are the same thing. Capitalism, greed are the exact same thing. But it wasn't capitalism. It was an all-powerful government. An all-powerful government that picks winners and losers. And in this pivotal instance in Bernie Sanders' life, Robert Moses picked a loser. And it was Bernie's beloved Dodgers. And Bernie has blamed capitalism ever since. I want to play the rest of that clip here for Milton Friedman.
The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear, that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
But it seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
And what does reward virtue? You think a communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us.
Well,
I don't even trust you to do that.
So good. Think about this. If someone gave that message to a 16-year-old Bernie Sanders, and if someone explained to him the role of Robert Moses in the destruction of his beloved Brooklyn Dodgers, if someone told those stories to Bernie when he was 16, maybe instead of Bernie growing up to hate capitalism and becoming a democratic socialist communist, maybe he would have grown up to hate big government and become a conservative. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Cider Crusaders, I feel like we haven't really talked about Bernie ever, really. Like, at least his policies. We've talked about, like, the movement of Bernie and his supporters, but we've never really broken down what he actually believes. So let's take a minute to do that. He's pretty crazy. We could characterize this lots of different ways. Like, let's back it up. For Trump, what was the craziest policy proposal that Trump had when he was running for president? Like the thing that was furthest to the right. When I think Trump's policy promises that he was making during the campaign, the first thing that comes to mind, I think for me, I think for everyone, was build a wall, right? Build a wall, have Mexico pay for it. The Mexico pay for it part, that was him just setting like a marketing anchor in the future, but let's just focus on the policy of building a wall. Like, Was that outrageous? Was that an outrageous plan to run on? Every Republican forever has talked about border enforcement and building a fence. So you just changed it from fence to wall, and like that makes him a radical far-right extremist. Every Democrat has talked about border enforcement. There's a clip going around, I saw it this morning for the first time, of Amy Klobuchar in 2006. She was at some debate talking about building a border fence, and then she criticized George W. Bush for not cracking down enough on companies that hire illegal immigrants. Okay, that's Amy Klobuchar not that long ago. So like really think about this. Was there any position that Trump talked about on the campaign trail that was too far to the right for the Republican Party? I can't think of anything that he articulated where Republicans were like, whoa, that's a lot. I don't know if anything, the concern was that Trump wouldn't be conservative enough, that he was some sort of secret New York Democrat in disguise. Remember the National Review? They put that Never Trump edition out. We talked about it a couple weeks ago. We reviewed and went back and read them again and to see how wrong a lot of these people were. But a lot of the concerns that top conservatives had during the Republican primary was that he was really a Democrat. He's like this secret Democrat, and he's going to win in the Republican Party, and then he's going to turn out to be this far lefty. So, no, and I don't remember at all any Republican voter concerned that he's too far to the right. I bring all that up because that's the problem right now for the Democrats and Bernie. Bernie's as far to the left, like way further to the left than Trump was running in the Republican primary to the right. You know what I'm trying to say? He's as far left as any American can really ever be. So let's start with the $34 trillion Medicare for all. Some people say $60 trillion. I'll be generous here. Let's say it's $34 trillion. Now that's over 10 years. So let's just, for the sake of this conversation, let's just say $3.4 trillion a year. Medicare for all. $3.4 trillion. A little perspective on $3.4 trillion. The United States government spends about $600 billion on the entire military. $600 billion on the entire military. Every single aspect of the military, $600 billion. Bernie's talking $3.4 trillion. Now, a little perspective on our $600 billion for the military. That's an enormous amount of money. China, our big superpower foe, spends about $200 billion on their military. So we spend $600 billion. China spends $200. Russia spends $70 billion. And France they have the biggest military budget in Europe. They spend about $63 billion. Every other country in Europe spends $50 billion or less. So like England spends $50 billion on their military. They're $50 billion. We're $600 billion on our military. And Medicare for all would be $3.4 trillion, being generous. That is just an insane amount of money. So that's the first thing. He wants the bailout student loan nonsense. That's $1.6 trillion. And it's not even the financial cost of that. I can't even fathom the social implications of bailing out everybody's student loans. Or I should say, it's not everybody, it's everybody who hasn't paid their student loans, right? The social implications of that, like the people who have paid off their loans are gonna pay for people who haven't paid off their loans. Like, I don't think so. You're gonna get people who made a lot of sacrifices in their life to pay out people who made bad financial decisions, who took out $100,000 in loans for their sociology degree, and their big plan was to pay it back $80 a month for the next 200 years. Like that was their thing. And my wife and I, who have made major life decisions to cut back so we could pay off our student loans, I'm gonna pay for that guy? Like, no way. People freak out. And Carville mentioned that the other day too. Because remember we played the video of someone confronting Elizabeth Warren for the same thing, and she just totally brushed him off. Like, you can't go around campaigning on that you're gonna have everyone else who did the responsible thing pay off the loans for everyone who didn't. That's insane. It's one of the worst social ideas that anyone could conceive of. The incentives that screws up for everyone. It's pretty wild. Do you remember what triggered the Tea Party? Do you remember the Tea Party? The beginning moment of that? It was actually 11 years ago. 11 years? Yeah, 11 years ago, like this next week. It was Rick Santelli. Remember that name, Rick Santelli? I don't even know what that guy's up to these days. But he was on the floor of the Chicago Stock Exchange, and he was talking about Obama's mortgage bailout. And again, this was February 19, 2009, so we're coming up on the 11-year anniversary of this moment right here.
How about this, President and new administration? Why don't you put up a website to have people vote on the internet as a referendum to see if we really want to subsidize the losers' mortgages, or would we like to at least buy cars and buy houses in foreclosure and give them to people that might have a chance to actually prosper down the road and reward people that could carry the water instead of drink the water. This is America. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise their hand. How about we all? President Obama, are you listening?
And I also want to know where that guy is who was standing next to him who tried to like yell into Rick Santelli's microphone. It's worth watching the full clip on YouTube. It's like a 10-minute interview, and you can relive that moment. Now, in the full clip, one of the CNBC anchors back in New York says the word moral hazard. That's a moral hazard. When you bail out the people who can't pay their mortgage, same thing here, moral hazard when you bail out the people who haven't paid off their student loans. So a moral hazard in investment land, it's a system that's built up where someone can engage in risky behavior because they know that someone else will pay any potential negative implications of it. So, for example, Mike Slater, I am not going to go cliff diving because I know that if it goes wrong, I'm going to at least break some bones, and I don't want to do that. So I'm not going to go cliff diving. It's too risky for me. But if there was some system where if something went wrong and I crash landed and some other guy broke bones and I'd be fine, then I'd go cliff diving all day. That sounds awesome. So if a business makes a ton of bad investments, but they know that the taxpayer will bail them out in the end, they're not going to have to pay any of the cost of that, then they're going to be way more likely to continue to make more and more bad investments in the future. They have no skin in the game. So in the student loan game, someone is going to be way more likely to take on a ton of student debt for way longer than they should, for stupid degrees they shouldn't be getting, and pay back the absolute minimum amount, with the hopes that maybe some politician down the future will force everyone else to pay for my loan, right? We should not be incentivizing irresponsible behavior. Now, the colleges would love this because they would just get more and more money up front from these people who are making the bad decision to go to college. Here's the thing with the college. This whole student loan stuff, it's one of the biggest scams of the last few decades. It is an absolute scam and con game. It started with the politicians saying they want to get elected. So they say, oh, I promise I'm going to vote for me and I'll make college more affordable. And everyone's like, oh, I want college to be more affordable. College has been affordable forever, right? There's people listening right now who paid for college with like a summer job painting houses. College has always been affordable. I remember on my radio show, I live in San Diego, we had people call in, they're not old, like in their 50s, calling in saying that San Diego State, SDSU, was like $50 a semester to go to SDSU, and the parking pass was $70. So it was more expensive to park your car on the university than it was to go to the university. And that wasn't that long ago. So college, and I remember we did analysis once, maybe we can do it again. I looked at Yale, 1701 until like the 60s, 70s, college, the cost of tuition at Yale was pretty much the same. A slight increase, adjusted for inflation, was a slight increase. And as soon as politicians said, vote for me, I'll make it more affordable, that's when the price of it skyrocketed. Why? Because they offered bigger and bigger loans. So the colleges just raised their tuition. They say, we think people can afford to pay $1,000 for college. Well, the government comes in and says, okay, here's a $1,000 loan. I just made your college more affordable. So the college says, well, now college is $2,000. Because we know people can afford $1,000, and the government's just giving everyone a free $1,000, so it's now $2,000. So then another politician comes in and says, I'm going to make it more affordable. And here's $10,000 in student loans. And the university says, well, now college is $20,000, right? So they make it more and more and more expensive. And the colleges love it because they just get the cash up front. They get the money right now. They don't care that they stuck you, the student, with a bill for the rest of your life. So the politician gets reelected because of his promise to make college more affordable, and the colleges get the cash, and you're screwed. It's one of the biggest scams ever. College has always been affordable until politicians started saying, vote for me, and I'll make it more affordable. So Bernie is just going to make it worse. You pay off everyone's student loans, the colleges are going to say, we're going to make college $200,000 a year. And that's Bernie's other plan, is to make college tuition free. So we're going to bail out everyone who made bad decisions in the past, and now we're going to essentially pre-bail out. We're going to make college tuition free for everyone, which just means that everyone's got to pay for everyone's college. Right now, that's insane. We already pay for everyone's K through 12. How's that going? How's that working out for us? Is that fiscally responsible, let alone any productive outcome? You think college is expensive now? Wait until the government pays for it. Wait till it's free for everyone. You kidding me? Sorry, get a little fired up. That's the worst policy proposal ever. He's also talking about rent control. He's talking about getting rid of ICE and Border Patrol. The Green New Deal, he's all in on that. Obviously, AOC's campaigning with him. We're going to talk in the next segment here about the New Way Forward Act, which is, it's the Green New Deal, but for immigration. It's like off the charts crazy. He wants to ban fracking, no more nuclear power. He wants to allow felons to vote for prison, for the love of Pete. So you see what I'm talking about? Like, these are stuff where if you're your middle-of-the-road Democrat, you're looking at this stuff and you're like, whoa, like this is crazy far to the left. There was no policy that Trump campaigned on that if you were a middle-of-the-road Republican, that you were like, wow, style, yes, right? If you're a Kasich, then you were like, oh, he's too mean or whatever. That's different. I'm talking policy. There's no policy that Trump campaigned on that if you were a Republican, you were like, wow, that's some psycho far-right stuff right there, right? Nothing was outside of normal conservative thought. Again, you don't like style, that's fine. You could think maybe he wasn't serious about his whatever. Again, you could think he was maybe a Democrat in disguise. You could think he wouldn't get that stuff done because no politicians ever do. But no one ever said, wow, that's way to the right. But everyone is looking at Bernie and saying, geez, that's really far. And I wonder how many of his supporters really even know that that's true or have really given any thought to it at all. And that's pretty scary. How many of them don't, it's weird. It's like how many don't know he's that far to the left or don't care. They just like the idea of Bernie. Man, weird. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Slater Crusaders, I remember yesterday we talked in pretty good detail about this new documentary about Clarence Thomas and his life and the amazing redemption story and the story arc of him. And I'm honored to talk to the documentary filmmaker behind it, Michael Pack from Manifold Productions. Again, the movie's called Created Equal, Clarence Thomas in his own words. Mr. Pack, how are you, sir?
I'm well. Thank you for having me on your show.
My pleasure. I'm glad you're here. So what inspired you to make this? Oh, by the way, I should tell everyone, Rotten Tomatoes, this is how you know it's a good documentary. 29% critics, 98% audience. And it's this movie would get reviews like that. So congratulations on that. What inspired you to make this, and how did you get Clarence Thomas to go along with it?
Well, I had heard from mutual friends that he was getting tired of being defined by his enemies and the people on the left that didn't agree with him, and the half-truths and untruths that were circulating about him. So I had a meeting with him, and I didn't really know that much about him before that meeting. But after the meeting and doing some research, I discovered what probably most of your listeners know. He has a great story, a classic American success story. He came from dire poverty in the Deep South and the segregated South to the highest court in the land through many twists and turns. And once I knew the story, it was a story I wanted to tell, and luckily he trusted us to tell it.
Yeah, one of the reasons why we would have talked about it anyway, but it tied in nicely with AOC's comments a couple days ago about how there's no such thing as bootstraps, pulling yourself from your bootstraps.
That's right.
It's like, oh, well, here's Clarence Thomas. Like, this is a perfect story. Can you begin to describe for us his childhood and what, like, a poverty-stricken childhood he had, what that looked like?
Well, that's right. It's really hard to even imagine today. He was born in Pinpoint, Georgia, a Gullah-speaking area on the coast of Georgia, in dire poverty, and his father left before he could even remember, as leaving a deep hole in his life. And then his mother, when he was 6, moved to Savannah. And in Savannah, he experienced, as he said, he went from rural poverty to urban squalor. And in Savannah, he didn't have enough to eat. It was cold in the winter. they had only had an outdoor toilet, and it flushed in the neighbor's yard, and the neighbor's toilet flushed in his yard. I mean, they lived in conditions that are, I think, currently virtually unimaginable in America. And it was the segregated South. It was the Jim Crow era. So that was real poverty. And his life turned around when he was about 8, and his mother took him and his brother to his grandfather and asked his grandfather to raise him because she felt she could not. And his grandfather changed his life around. It gave him tough love, decent values, hard work, sent him to parochial schools, then segregated, run by these Irish nuns who he loved, and he thrived there, and that's what changed his life.
Amazing. How do you think living in poverty affected him as an adult?
I think it affects him deeply. I mean, he knows what that's like. So as he says, he's really suspicious of programs that are all big on theory and don't help actual poor people. And he understands that, having been an actual poor person. So, as he said, there are a lot of theories that are like instant coffee. You know, have theory, add water, add people. But that's not what he doesn't really believe that. He wants things that work, and he knows it firsthand, both from living in deep poverty and also from this sort of working class life with his grandfather. His grandfather was what we would have to actually call poor today, but working poor. I mean, he had his own heating oil business, but he hardly earned any money. But he thought of himself as self-sufficient. He was self-sufficient. He built his house himself. He worked for himself. And so Clarence Thomas knows and reveres that kind of life as well.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest lesson was he learned from his grandpa?
Well, he said during his contentious confirmation hearings, he quoted his grandfather saying, "You can give out, but you can't give up." And that's one lesson, and he did not do that. His grandfather was fond of saying, "Old man Kant is dead, I help bury him," meaning no excuses. If I ask you to do something, do it. And he had a lot of those sayings. And working from sun to sun, Clarence Thomas still gets up before the sun and works until well after it sets. And his grandfather, who was functionally illiterate, he had less than 6 months education. He, as Clarence Thomas said, had to deal with things as they are. The reality of the sun, the reality of work. He believed in hard work more than anything, and so does Justice Thomas. I mean, he has obviously had a great success story, but I think he would attribute it at least as much to working hard as his native genius.
Yeah, this is a really interesting line. He had to deal with things as they are. That's really interesting. What do you mean by that?
I think, our film, as you know, is really based on 30 hours of interviews with Clarence Thomas. And he tells his story his way by looking right at the camera and speaking to the audience. So I'm here quoting him and trying to interpret him, but it's far better to hear him directly, which is why your listeners should go see the movie. Yes. Which they can find out where it's playing, by the way, at justicethomasmovie.com. That's our website. We list all the theaters, and if it's not playing near them, they can, if there are 40 or 50 of them, we can make an event happen near them. So we have Clarence Thomas saying these things, and that is a quote from him. So it's just my interpretation. I think he meant that because his grandfather couldn't read, he had to deal with reality. He couldn't hide behind these theories. He had to actually make things work in the real world, in the practical world, and he couldn't be lost in theorizing.
Yeah, really good. Does he have any bitterness towards his either biological dad or his mom or anyone from his early childhood?
Clarence Thomas feels he was blessed, and he feels he was blessed by having his grandfather and these Irish nuns raise him. I mean, he went through a bitter period. After doing so well in parochial school, he decided he wanted to be a priest. Not a lot of people know about Justice Thomas, and he entered the seminary, and they were all white seminaries. They were just then desegregating. And there he experienced racism. It rose to a peak in 1968 when they were watching TV the day Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. And one of the white seminarians said, "I hope that son of a bitch dies." And that was really shocking to Justice Thomas, who by then felt the church wasn't doing enough for civil rights. And that, among other things, made him suddenly radicalized him, we might say. And he began to feel race and racism explained everything. His grandfather was a sucker. He became what he called an angry black man. He then decided he didn't want to be a priest. His grandfather kicked him out of the house. He had to go wherever he could. And he happened to have a full scholarship at Holy Cross, and he went there, and he had continued his radicalism. He hung around with Marxists. They supported, as he says, everyone who was in your face, from Angela Davis to Malcolm X. And that was a period where he experienced this kind of resentment. But he sort of worked through it and came out the other end. And that's what makes him different, I think.
Wow, that's amazing. Like, his life could have been just a solid trajectory from the bottom to the top, if you will. Or it could have been like from the bottom and he's doing really well and then just falls off and is consumed by anger and hatred and activism. But it's up and then down and then like there's a pivot again. So what's that pivot where he was redeemed himself?
Well, the beginning of the pivot was he went to a anti-war rally in nearby Cambridge that turned into a near riot. And he felt himself getting caught up in the violence and madness of the mob. And he just hated what he had become. And when he went back to Holy Cross well after midnight, he went to the chapel, which obviously was closed. And he hadn't prayed in a long time. But after that, he went to the chapel and asked God to take anger out of his heart. And he said, if you take anger out of my heart, I will never hate again. And that was the beginning of his spiritual journey back to faith. And it was the beginning of his political journey back to what he thinks, conservative values, what he thinks of as the values of his grandfather. That process took a lot longer, the political part, but that was the beginning.
Wow, that's amazing. Does he have any regrets of his life that he told you?
He feels he feels he was blessed. He feels he sees the evidence of divine providence in his life. Not to say that he doesn't think things were bad. I mean, once he finally did become a conservative and went to work for the Reagan administration, he was then attacked by the left. And those attacks have gone on from the 80s to today, perhaps reaching a peak during the Anita Hill part of his hearings. Clearly, he doesn't like being attacked, and he thought those were unfair. Most of them were unfair. Some of them are tinged with racism. But I think he feels overall that his life was blessed. He's after all, a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, a kind of wonderful position and a powerful position.
Yeah, can you speak to that for a second? Because there's still this really beautiful, I think, mystique around the court, and it's how they get along and kind of stay away from the fray in a lot of ways, although maybe that's not so much the case anymore. What's your takeaway from the Supreme Court in general and their lives?
Well, it is a mysterious institution, and there are only 9 of them, and people wonder about their lives. And I think we are lucky in the fact that people don't know a lot about Justice Thomas in particular, because he doesn't speak in oral argument and doesn't give many interviews. So I think people are curious, and whatever their politics, people are interested in such a powerful, significant person should go to the film. But I think the Supreme Court is a great institution. And Justice Thomas, as you know, has a judicial philosophy called originalism. And he believes the business of a judge is not to make law. That is, of course, the business of the legislative branch of Congress, but to interpret it. And that means to interpret it in the light in which it was intended based on the public understanding at the time. And that is a great function. Really crafted by John Marshall, an early Chief Justice, but that idea of protecting our constitutional rights is a really significant function. Rights that were first, the principles of which were first in the Declaration of Independence, which is why we call our film Created Equal, all men are created equal. But those principles are embodied in the Constitution, and it's a very great function to be the one institution that preserves those rights.
Yeah, we need to know more about him, and that's why I want everyone to go see this documentary. Last question for you, sir. What was your takeaway from it all? Like, biggest lesson you learned you can apply to your life, and what do you want people to walk away from this film?
The biggest lesson I learned, and this relates to something you asked me earlier about how he relates to his life, is his resilience in the face of many, many setbacks. We only outlined a few. His resilience and his unwillingness to think of himself as a victim. He could think of himself as a victim, as we discussed a little bit earlier. Yeah. You know, he grew up in the segregated South. He was poor. He went through an angry period, but he refuses to define himself that way, even with all that cause. And we all make that choice. And I find that inspiring.
That's great. And we need that, especially today where victimhood is heralded as high as much as it is now. Michael Pack, Manifold Productions, created equal, Clarence Thomas in his own words. Sir, where do we find out if it's playing near us, and how do we bring it to us if it's currently not?
You have to go to the website, clarencethomasmovie.com. We list all the theaters it's playing. It's in about 30 now. But if it's not in one near you, there's a place on the website where you can sign up. And if you can get a group of 30, 40 people, we can make an event happen where you are. And it's been in the theaters a couple weeks. If people go, it'll be there more. Sometimes people more sympathetic to people like Justice Thomas don't go to the movies. People have made the Ruth Bader Ginsburg movie a great success and her an icon. Yeah. The same surely should be done for Clarence Thomas, but that doesn't happen. People don't actually go to the theater, buy tickets and go to the theater. So I appeal to your viewers to go to justicethomasmovie.com and go to a theater, even if they've got to drive a half hour to get there.
I agree with all that as well. And I can't wait to see it with, my kids are a little too young right now, but in a couple of years to watch again with them, to teach all those lessons that you spoke about here.
It's great for kids.
Yeah. Michael Pack, Manifold Productions. It's justicethomasmovie.com, is that right?
Yes, exactly.
Beautiful. Thanks, Michael. I appreciate you. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. True story. Mike Slater. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day. Spread the word.